and not calling attention to who caused this, who murdered our fellow Americans. Most of the 9/11 hijackers, terrorists, murderers, whatever you want to call them, 15 out of the 19 were all from Saudi Arabia. How many of you, when you reflect on 9/11, think about Saudi Arabia? That's why we wanted to talk about it. Now, 11 years later, what about the Saudis and the war on terror? Joining us now, Jonathan Schanzer of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies has studied this very deeply. And Jonathan, why? You know, why were they Saudis, and why is that significant?
Well, Jenna, I think you need to take a step back and take a look at the Saudi system that's been developed over the years. It is a xenophobic one. It is based in Wahhabi Islam, which is a radical offshoot sect of Islam. And so for many years, the Saudis were teaching hatred. They were teaching it in their schools, in the madrasas. They were preaching it in their Friday sermons. They were putting it in textbooks. And it was to teach Muslims worldwide that Westerners were the enemies, that Christians and Jews were the enemies, and that Islam was to reign supreme. And we ignored that for many, many years. And then finally we woke up on 9/11 to find out that 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, that the mastermind of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, was also a Saudi. And so we began to crack down on the Saudis, pressuring them to do something about the system that they created. Now, the good news is that the Saudis have taken that seriously. They really have done a lot to stem the flow of terror finance. You can see fewer instances of overt radicalization and calls to violence right now in Saudi literature. But the concern is that xenophobia and that Islamic-centric ideology still exists.
Are they the driver of that ideology, or just one of the participants?
I would have to say that they are probably still the drivers of it. Now, of course, we've got other offshoots. We've got Al-Qaeda itself, which has morphed. You've got the Pakistanis. You've got others who propagate a radical interpretation of Islam. But certainly the Saudis, I think, can still take responsibility for a great deal of the radicalization that we see today.
Now, Jonathan, you worked in the Treasury in 2004, 2005, and one of the things that you were doing is taking a look at where the money for terror was coming from. And where was the money for some of this terror financing coming from, and where is it coming from today?
Well, early on, it was very clear that the Saudis were a huge part of the problem, and so I think there was a great deal of effort placed on curbing the financing of terror. And the Saudis, I think, after a good bit of cajoling, finally did a good job, and they've curbed it. Now, the question is, if there were billions of dollars and then they cut it by half, you still have billions of dollars out there, and I think so. The Saudis are continue to be a problem. But by and large, what we've seen is that terror financing has really gone underground. You've got bulk cash smuggling, you've got trade-based money laundering, so it's a lot harder to figure out exactly where the cash is coming from, although we can still say that a lot of our petrodollars that go to the Gulf, whether it's Qatar or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, that really does seem to be where most of the financing emanates from.
You know, it's interesting, Jonathan, you and I have talked on the air numerous times about how are we engaging Iran, how are we engaging Pakistan, what about Yemen? We very infrequently talk about how we're engaging the Saudis. How are we engaging the Saudis when it comes to this issue or others?
Well, the Saudis have been a very interesting ally for us, but it's been an uneasy alliance. So on the one hand, the Saudis are working with us right now to produce additional oil while we try to impose sanctions on the Iranians. They're making up a lot of the excess oil that the world is lacking, and so they're helping us on that front. But at the same time, I think they are an ambivalent ally. They continue, if you take a look at what's being propagated on the internet by a lot of their preachers and even state-sanctioned clergy, it is still, it reflects a great deal of ambivalence about Western society, a hatred for other religions. And so that's the part that you don't hear about. What you hear about more and more is the oil and the improved relations that we've had with the Saudis in recent years.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. We heard from the president at the Pentagon today. He said again that our fight is not with Islam, but we're talking about the specific type of ideology in Islam that's inspiring these terror attacks and is still inspiring plots if they haven't been carried through on our soil, Jonathan. So what about combating that ideology, and what does it look like now? You mentioned the internet, you mentioned some of these state-sanctioned clerics in Saudi Arabia. What are we really facing?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think the ideology, it's important to note that this is a minority offshoot of Islam. Let's say it represents 20% of the Islamic faith. The problem is that with the billions of Muslims out there, you're still looking at perhaps, a population of the United States that still views the United States as a problem. 300 plus million people that view America and the West as an enemy. And so this is the ideology that we continue to combat. And I think that there's been a reticence in recent years to even call it that, to include the word Islam when talking about this ideology. But I think it's incredibly important, and not because Islam is the problem, but rather because moderate Islam is the solution. And when you take a look at what's being propagated online, when you take a look at the messaging that's out there, you still see a good deal of intolerance. I think a lot of the messaging has been dialed back. They're not overtly calling for violence any longer the way they did pre-9/11, but you're still seeing a hatred. You're still seeing an utter disdain for Western values that come through there, and I think that continues to power this ideology, and perhaps, again, not driving us to violence, but certainly seeing, probably stopping just short of that. And so the question that I have is, at what point do they just turn that up just a little bit and the violence could begin again?
Still a lot of work to be done. Jonathan, thank you for the time today. Appreciate your perspective as always.